This topic today I'm going to talk about is separatism. Separatism is an advocacy of cultural, ethnic, tribal, religious, racial, governmental or gender separation from the larger group. Now, I spoke about division in a previous post, but as with secession, separatism conventionally refers to full political separation. Groups simply seeking greater autonomy are not separatists as such. So with discourse settings equate separatism with religious segregation. So this means with religious segregation we could say, right, people who are Christian believe in this, people who are Islam believe in this, people who are Jews believe in this, people who Hindus believe in this, and so forth. That's how we segregate it. And actually what most people do in cities and places around the world is we also segregate these into different areas. That's why, for example, if you go to the City of London, you will find there's certain places which are full of mosques, which we know is more of a Muslim area. There's areas where in England where there's more Hindu temples, so they are more Hindu population, and so forth and so on. This happens a lot. Racial segregation is also slightly different because this turns into different races. Now, most people think of racial segregation as black and white, but it's not, because the idea of racial, and again I'm going to talk about racism later on, is with racism, it's about a different race. So actually, if you are English, that is one race. But if you're French, you are actually considered a different race. Though you might have similar skin colour, could have some of the same ideologies in conquering and your actual politics, you are actually different racial structures, because you've got different ways of how your population were informed, religious ideology, and so forth. So racism and also the prejudice of that is that we then, with our own selves, we're very much into tribal ideals. So within this idea of, in spiritual terms, we say find your own tribe. Well, finding your own tribe is quite an interesting idea, because actually, to be honest, people, I believe, shouldn't be so tribal. The idea is actually, when it says find your own tribe, is actually find people who have an ideology which is more unified. But actually most people are not. So even if you make a lot of spiritual people, and that's one of the issues in spiritual movement, is people think, oh, if I'm someone spiritual, they're all the same, we all think the same. We do not. Because our constructs, our social conditioning is very different. Also with separatism, we have sex segregation. So this could be between not just a gender of female and male, but obviously now because we look at the spectrum as a larger issue, which is not an issue, because actually there are people who are not sure if they're male or female. Some people are homosexual, some people are heterosexual, some people are not too sure what they are. They're still confused, could be confused, or they could be still deciding. There's all different things. So the broader view that separatism by choice may serve useful purposes is not the same as government-enforced segregation. You see, so when, for example, if we look at the idea of when we segregate, we can do it in the idea of girls and boys. So we can do this in sport, for example, because the idea is we segregate and we go, this is where males compete with things and women compete with this. Now this is where there's also a lot of issues with the trans movement, because they say, oh, why are trans, who if someone was born a man shouldn't be able to compete with a woman? Again, this is causing this divide and conquer issue again. When we look at separatist groups practice a form of identity politics, this is where we can do this. So groups may have one or more motivations for separation. Okay, so this is the motivations for separatism: emotional resentment and hatred of rival communities. So if, for example, you are brought up by a certain religion or a certain construct, you could believe that you don't believe someone is of equal human worth because of your construct. And the emotional resentment could also be that, for example, people may go, oh, well, people, they get more than what I do, and I'm a native. Why is that happening? This is where they use immigration ideas. Also motivation for separatism is protection from genocide and ethnic cleansing. Now we've seen ethnic cleansing happening in a lot of things. We saw this in Rwanda, in the 90s, we saw this in Kosovo, we have seen this now with Israel and Gaza, because we've got the Israelis versus Islamic. We've got this idea, so the idea of protection from genocide and ethnic cleansing is quite important, because it means that what we've got is terrorism and separatists and so forth cause these issues. Other motivations is resistance by victims of oppression, including degradation of their language, culture and religion. And degradation, this happens a lot in culture. So for example, in America, Native Americans weren't allowed to use their own language. They weren't allowed to even celebrate their own holidays. In Canada, they stopped the Inuits being able to speak in their own language, do their certain things, and also they were then converted to Catholicism. In China, they've done this with the Uyghur Muslims, where they've actually put them into camps and actually trying to brainwash them into becoming Chinese. So the idea of these victims of is degradation of their language, culture and religion, and they also, another place, it was Ireland. The English did this with Ireland. What they did is they actually told the Irish they couldn't speak Gaelic, they weren't allowed to do their celebration, they weren't allowed to do their culture, and this also goes into their Celtic culture. So in Ireland, people had to learn Gaelic, I think, in private and secret, because it was actually a criminal offence. Again, being English is quite interesting, because when you actually understand about English culture, you actually understand about how suppressive our royal family, our ideology and governments have done to other cultures. And it's actually quite shocking, because at one time the British Empire owned nearly 75% of the world. So there was a lot of damage done. Anyway, carry on. Motivations for separatism is influence and propaganda by those inside and outside the region to hope to gain political from intergroup conflict and hatred. So again, people will use this idea of victimhood and then explain about how they try and identify and find things which they identify. So with humanity, we try and do this with the idea of empathy. And this propaganda is that, which is very much propagated by the media. So with world wars, we were always told how we defeated the Germans, or how we defeated these people, or how we were defeating this, and a lot of it actually wasn't actually true. There's a lot of actual things now, as history programs show, is that a lot of the war wasn't as clean cut as it made out. And in fact, when you actually understand about the idea of war, is that both sides are actually funded by the same people who create weapons. So people who create weapons aren't indiscriminate as long as they're making money. Another motivation for separatism is economic and political dominance of one group that does not share power and privilege in an egalitarian fashion. So the idea is this is where people come into the idea of totalitarianism. And this is actually comes from communism. It could be seen in Zionism within Israel. Some people believe that. It could also be seen as, like, for example, the Americas believe this, because they believe America's the best, America's the greatest, America's the biggest country. And America actually has its own ideals based on empire, which is actually based on the Roman Empire ideals. So when we look at every empire has an issue, because all empires fall. They usually, average empire lasts about 250 years, not much more than that. And that's due to the persecution of the people in different countries or different societies, and then they become independent because they don't like to be controlled by rules which don't suit their culture. This is why, for example, I don't understand why we try and get involved in wars in countries where their ideology is not matching ours. It just doesn't make sense to me. But again, this is from a spiritual concept. Economic motivations, very much a thing why people want to do separatists, because they want to keep money for themselves. Preservation of threatened religions, language and other cultural traditions. So this is where people will not allow people to learn different things. So in some respects, when people are learning different cultures or learning different spiritual practices, many people are very reluctant to share it. So actually, when I lived in India, when I was wanting to learn some of the Nadi astrology, they were not very keen on teaching me. It was only that when I'd done my reading and they found out that my great-grandmother was from India, they were actually, okay, there is lineage there, and they understood that. And it's actually, when they found that lineage, they kind of were willing to talk about me learning that skill. It's quite interesting how people do that, because the idea is most information was actually from word of mouth. And obviously what people do is, when you're learning lineage and learning traditions, a lot of it is not always written. Some of it is spoken, and it's directed from lineage to lineage. But however, we have to preserve people's cultural traditions, because that is their actual ethos of who they are, is their identity. I think it's a very important thing. Separatists, again, destabilisation from one separatist movement giving rise to others. This is where a lot of people are getting very worried about where the rise of a separatist movement will come along. And this is why, for example, we have to be worried about the next thing I'm going to talk about, which is conflict and terrorism. Because the thing is, once it could actually have someone who's controlling this to stop terrorism happening. Because once separatist groups start happening, they all have different ideologies, which then cause conflict within that, which then also then causes conflict for the ideology, which actually may be keeping most people safe. These are just things you have to think of. Continuing fragmentation as more and more states break up. So we know this with, for example, the scramble for Africa. Obviously, Africa originally wasn't called Africa. It was originally Ethiopia. Ethiopia meaning ethnic of Topia. That's what actually the word originally Ethiopia was. You had Upper Ethiopia and Lower Ethiopia, and then different tribes divided land up. So actually, a lot of African countries were not called what they are called now. For example, Zimbabwe is now back to its original name, but it was called Rhodesia because of a guy called Cecil Rhodes who took over it. So there's a lot of this stuff, and in India this is happening as well. Now people are changing their name. So Bangalore is now called Bengaluru, which is its original Bharat Indian name. So we have to look at these things and why they do this. And the breaking of states also has caused problems because it breaks up tribal lines, which then causes tribal conflict. But then the idea of conflict then actually causes a form of control, because if people are in conflict, they're actually not looking at what's going on with the ideology. So conflict's a very clever tactic to divide people. And the idea is opposition to political decisions with separation, and then the perception that the state can no longer support one's own group has betrayed their interests. So sometimes a lot of leaders, because they want to believe in one ideology, it doesn't actually mean it identifies with their people. And if we actually look at most empires, why they break up is because their people do not believe the rules suit them. This is why the Egyptian Empire fell, the Roman Empire fell, the Greek Empire fell, the Persian Empire fell. It's why the British Empire fell. It is why the Portuguese Empire fell, the Spanish Empire fell, the French Empire fell. Again, these are a lot of European empires, but they all fell because what they did is they tried to dominate these countries with these ideologies which didn't suit their traditions, and it didn't actually suit the way they work either. So I think with the idea of when we want to look at cultural ideas is instead of looking at the linguistic, religious and racial differences, the idea is that we actually should be also willing to understand that we can be separate in our identities of our religion, our cultural, our gender and so forth, but we also can find a ideology and a link to an ideal that actually is where we actually cohesively live together. This is very hard though, because of what happens is that most people then believe that with racial separation and so forth, is that people then believe that for the interests of people to actually work, it has to, they don't try and find an identity of things working. So, for example, when we look at the idea of the partition of India again, separatist parts, and then we also have in India, the Sikhs also want an independent nation as well, because they don't like the idea of how India is ran. In fact, Indira Gandhi actually caused a lot of problems with the Indian military Operation Blue Star against the Sikhs, where they actually tried to destroy their holy temple, the Golden Temple. So even within other things as well, separatist groups in the Philippines, there's Thailand, there's India, republics, Africa exactly as well. So then we get obviously the next thing, which is where the conflict and terrorism comes, and I'm going to discuss that now of why that happens.